and yet he found it very difficult. And it may be a pipeline to prison not because of the education they were receiving, but because of a lot of other stuff, like drugs and the culture we live in, the TV, the violence on TV and in the movies. It may be that people aren't reading very much anymore because they're getting their information electronically. It may be because of parental absence at home, or no father in the home. I don't think you can blame education for the entire social problem that we have that you alluded to as a pipeline to prison. America spends more money on education, I think, per student than any other city in any other country, state in the world, or country in the world. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think that's true. I know that when I was mayor, more than half of the tax bill, property tax bill, went to the schools and not to civil government. And yet you ask, what's the result of all that? And I don't think it has to do with the quality of teachers. I think there are good teachers and bad teachers, just like there's good preachers and bad preachers. But
good mayors and bad mayors.
Good mayors and bad mayors. But I really feel as though this problem is almost intractable, and that's why there are two preachers you asked couldn't answer it. I think education should be conducted locally. I think it should be adequately funded. I think teachers are probably the most underpaid profession in America. And yet, just pouring more money at it evidently hasn't solved the problem. There have been efforts, I mean, just think of the efforts here. Tom Binford led an effort. Dale, what was his name? Dale Evans?
Dean Evans.
Dean Evans led an effort to help the schools. Andre Lacey did. And get the business community involved. I tried when I was mayor to replicate the Boston Compact here in Indianapolis, and have a business adopt a high school and kids, and try to get kids to finish school and not jump over college and get the dimes by becoming hamburger flippers or something.
What about other questions? He's going to finish this. Justice Sullivan?
Mayor, last night I told my wife I was going to come hear you speak today, and she said that he must be taking enormous satisfaction at the Super Bowl coming to Indianapolis, because it wouldn't be here without him, and I think we all feel that way and are thinking of you in this regard. Probably 100 questions, but maybe one that is apropos of the precise topic of this, and you alluded to this a couple of times. When Senator Kennedy was running for president, he gives this very famous speech in September of 1960 to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, and he says, I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell a president, should he be a Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would instruct his parishioners as to how to vote. And I wondered, and you alluded to that as being, I think, if I may say so, similar to your own philosophy. And I wonder if you think that things are different today when Senator Kennedy gave that speech, and if they've changed, why, or maybe the fact that he had to give that speech meant that things were pretty much the same then as they are today.
Well, I think they're pretty much the same as they were then, only more so. There's more pluralism. I mean, when Jack Kennedy was running for president, I doubt if he ever once thought about Muslims in America. But now there's lots of Muslims. There's lots of Latinos in America, much more so than it used to be. And in a pluralistic society, I think the government has to be the umpire. And I think there is a wall. But I don't think it's an absolute wall. I think it's a membrane, if you want to put it that way. Push it a little bit this way, push it a little bit that way. I mean, put "In God We Trust" on our coins and on our dollar bills. Open Congress with prayer, have chaplains in the service. So it's, in my opinion, not an absolute wall. What the First Amendment does is to say that the government shall not take sides in religion, that there is no such thing as an established church. And that, as I said earlier, freedom of religion does not mean freedom from religion. And I think it's just as true now as it was way back when. Of course, when Al Smith was running for president back in the late 1920s, you know, the Catholic thing was very strong then. And Kennedy had to overcome that to a certain extent, which he did with that speech. Just like I think, frankly, Obama did in his speech in Philadelphia where he dealt with the race question. It's the same thing. I regret to say this, but I really feel it's true that a lot of the antagonism toward the president is racially based. Nobody will admit that, but I think it's there. And that's very unfortunate.
Dick Hamilton.
Dick Hamilton.
Bill, I've remembered for a long time that you said in a public setting after you'd left the mayor's office that at the time in which you were very actively trying to bring the African American community into police representation, and in other ways you were taking special action to try to help bridge the roles of the races in this community. And many in the churches, the kind of churches you served, were appreciative of that. But you said afterwards you felt really isolated because you didn't hear, you didn't feel, you didn't see any real support for what you were doing from the churches. Now, you've expressed very clearly and strongly, and I would endorse that all the way, the problems when religious faith is brought into interaction with the public life, and the way in which that sometimes is overdone, overly aggressive, overly arrogant, and we see that all around us today. But there is an opposite reality in our church life today, in the churches you served and the ones I served. And that is a kind of fear of doing anything at all to address public issues. I'd like to ask you to think about 2 or 3 of the most important issues in public life today, and then reflect on what you would wish to hear were you the mayor or the governor or the president from the religious community. What kind of actions should local churches take to engage constructively, with some humility, but constructively, with public issues?
Thank you, Dick. That's a very important point to make. I think that the humility thing, and we'll get to your question in a minute, young man. I think the humility thing is important. Neatbury taught me the importance of avoiding self-righteousness. And there's a lot of self-righteousness today, and I think that's very unfortunate. Point number 2, you're right. I often felt lonely. Not that Bill Enright and I weren't close, and I considered him my pastor, and he was very, very good to me. But I'm talking as the mayor of the whole community. I felt lonely in the sense that there are very few ministers who I could get to be involved in life out there, in the public realm, in the public square. For example, I had zero support from those, the clergy, when I was trying to get an anti-pornography bill passed. Civil Liberties Union objected to it. Sarah Barker Evans upheld it. But the point was that I was concerned about the deleterious impact on property values and safety of the presence of X-rated bookstores and so forth in our community. And I had some statistics to back that up. But maybe that's a small point, but not a single clergyman that I can remember stood up publicly said bravo. Another issue that I think today is much more alive has to do with pro-life and pro-choice. And churches are split right down the middle on that, almost 50-50, 51-49. And I would like to hear people on both sides say that the public parties, public political parties, should be a big tent in which you're welcome, regardless of what your personal view is on this very personal subject of pro-life and pro-choice. And I felt quite isolated by that. My wife and I, mostly Beth, but me a little bit, had an article in the New York Times, or an op-ed piece, back in '92 on this subject, which said we're good Republicans but pro-choice. Well, fine, but there are a lot of pro-life people there too who isolated me when I was a delegate to that convention in Houston, and said hudnut doesn't belong in the Republican Party, and the guy, Bob, who came from Terre Haute somewhere and was in back of the Citizens United decision, held a news conference and said hudnut doesn't belong in our party because he's pro-choice. Well, I think that's wrong, and I agree with Dan Quayle, who talked about the Big Ten. And I think it would be wonderful if both parties said in their platform, we realize that some of the Democrats or some of the Republicans are pro-choice, and some are believe that life begins at conception and so forth, and just leave it there and let people make up their own minds rather than forcing them all into some kind of an ideological straitjacket. Now, I know there are people that disagree with that, but you asked me, that's just my point of view. The same goes for the horrendous problems we're having right now in getting Democrats and Republicans to work together over there. I do not see how it is possible to solve our economic problems at the national level if I don't hear people on both sides of the aisle standing up and saying, yes, we have to make some cuts. Yes, maybe there are some regulations we ought to do away with, but we also need to enhance revenues. Because otherwise you're not going to be able to deal with the real deficit problems that we have. Yes, we need to reform the tax structure. Maybe everybody should pay 9%, as Herman Cain said. Maybe everybody should pay 15%. I don't know.
On that note, we're going to have to go to the end.
Okay. John, you wind me up and I can go for it.
3 hours.
Mr. Hudnut, I don't know if we ever met before formally, but Matthew Tolley slipped you my number, and we had a chat about 2 years ago about my grandfather, Gordon Gilmore, who served on the council starting in the Lugar years until Goldsmith's final term. And I'm really appreciative. I was supposed to see you speak during that Four Mayors thing about a year ago, but I was sick during that time. So I'm really glad to hear you speak now. And I'm wondering, what do you think the philanthropic and faith-based community's role is in economic development? Because it seems over the past 10 or 20 years, it's almost entirely shifted to the government's role. And it seems to be less consulting with the faith-based, philanthropic, and people who are actually in the neighborhoods, on the ground, that are more familiar with the actual territory. Lafayette Square, for example, has had several either big corporate redos or city-backed redos, and all have failed. But over the past 4 years or so, lots of these ethnic restaurants, lots of people who have just moved here recently, just organically came up and thrived on their own. There's still issues for certain, but while the money is kind of being shuffled around downtown and brought up on Fountain Square, Lafayette Square has kind of had its own revitalization just almost accidentally. So what do you think the faith-based and philanthropic community's role is in economic development?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, pardon me? Yeah. Let me just say, first of all, that Gordon Gilmore was a good friend and a good ally. And I really appreciated the way in which he helped me as mayor, because I could always rely on him for a vote, if you want to put it that way. Be blunt about it.
Yeah, but it was a good vote.
It was a good vote. And he represented the area around Eagle Creek, out the northwest side of town.